What I'm going to talk about today is the ethics of AI, of course, as we all have been, but from a political economy approach. This thinking about the ethics of AI as a political economist is interesting and challenging in many ways. Not least because it raises the question of, well, what is political economy? So when we say that, what do we mean? Well, there are many, many answers. And for me, I always say political economy is a really big tent. So this is one of the reasons I really enjoy being a political economist. It facilitates asking really big questions, which is useful when we think about things like the emergence of AI, but also using a variety of methodologies, variety of analytic tools and techniques, different kinds of research strategies, and so forth. So it's a fun domain to operate in. But it still has to be put to use, particularly in contexts like this, when we want to be able to contribute to a conversation, in this case around AI. And so I have to make some choices in terms of the particular type of political economy questions and approaches I'll deploy. And so much of what's going to follow is going to be one slice, so one take on political economy that I'm trying to use to maybe address some of these questions. Okay, so one way to think about political economy is the study of societal transformation. Certainly, we can think about this in the context of the rise of modern capitalism, and that's not at all grandiose in the sense that the individuals that we tend to refer to as the classical political economists, Ricardo, Smith, Marx, people who came before, Montesquieu, Mandeville, and so forth, all the work that they did sought to both explain, on one hand, the kind of societal transformations that were taking place really from the 16th century onwards, as well as, and I think this is very important, not only explaining what was taking place, or trying to explain these changes that were taking place, but they also in many ways legitimized some of these changes as well, right, by providing new kinds of ideas, and especially new moral justifications, and this is crucial for the transformations that were taking place under modern capitalism. And again, if we think about the rise of capitalism as a big change in, amongst other things, societal relations, the kinds of reciprocities that existed in the pre-modern age were being broken apart and reformed into new kinds of reciprocities, new modes of exchange, primarily under markets, under modern capitalism, and of course not just in Europe, but around the world. Okay, so with that sort of take on political economy and what it is and what it can do for us, especially in terms of explaining and again providing justifications, I think both sides of this coin are very, very important, especially if we think about the kinds of legitimation that goes with contemporary markets, for example, and as I'll suggest and many others have noted today, with the development of artificial intelligence as well and what it may do in markets and society. Okay, so breaking that down just a little bit further, we can think about political economy within this context as a study of a number of things, but perhaps most crucially power relations. So again, going back to what I described as this transformation in social relations and governance. Much of what the early political economists, many of whom I should have noted the term political economy emerged really from a group of people that initially we thought about as moral philosophers, including the list of people I mentioned at the very beginning, but also questions of governance. Really what many were trying to explain was the changing role of the state, for example. Much of the work that they did legitimized different roles for the sovereign, so taming the Leviathan and taming the sovereign. This draws on people like Albert Hirschman's work in The Passions and the Interest, in showing how the work of many of these moral philosophers turned classical political economists instituted new ideas like rational self-interest. For example, as a means not only of explaining change, but also legitimizing the emergence of markets, new kinds of institutions like private property, and so forth. So within this context, what can we take to think about AI? Well, I'm going to focus a little bit more narrowly today on institutions. And by institutions, I mean rules, norms, and beliefs. And in particular, of course, moral beliefs. So turning from that, we can start to think about, well, what are the moral foundations of political economy that we might usefully bring to bear to think about the questions that emerge with the rise of AI? Well, one place that's always a little bit fun to begin is thinking about the paradoxes of capitalism. And here we can think about the work of Bernard Mandeville, and a kind of key question, which of course is always with us when we think of when we try to understand contemporary capitalism, and that question is greed good? I would ask people for the answer, but we get answers from different people, right? So, for example, this guy, right? So Gordon Gekko, Wall Street, right? Greed is good, right? It's always funny to me that Wall Street came out in 1987, a kind of pivotal moment in the real Wall Street. And these ideas recur, right? So not just in these periods of excesses like in the 1980s in the United States, but of course Gekko got rebooted a few years ago with The Wolf of Wall Street, right? Played by our friend here, always having a lot of fun. But really, this question of whether greed is good, to go back to Mandeville, is famously and maybe infamously in some respects, certainly at the time when it came out, encapsulated in his Fable of the Bees, which I'll read because I love reading Old English. The idea of the Fable of the Bees really was taken as a reconstitution of sets of beliefs and actions in society that previously were considered to be vices. What Mandeville and others sought to do was to invert what previously were thought about as vices to be thought about as societal goods. So here, for example, the very beginning of the Fable of Bees, he writes, "A spacious hive well stocked with bees that lived in luxury and ease, and yet as famed for law and arms as yielding large and early swarms, was counted the great nursery of sciences and industry. No bees had better government, more fickleness or less content. They were not slaves to tyranny, nor ruled by wild democracy, but kings that could not be wrong because their power was circumscribed by laws." So a lot happening here where Mandeville really is talking about the role of the state, the rise of new institutional mechanisms of decision-making, so what we would think about today, for example, as democracy, taming of the sovereign, a reconstitution of what we think about as Leviathan, the emergences of what is today common, thinking about science and industry, but at this time in 1732 was really very new, right? And really thinking about fundamentally new kinds of new tools of governance, for example, the role, or reconstitutions of tools of governance, for example, the role of law. So we might turn from this to newer paradoxes of capitalism. And here we go to another, much more modern, but also considered political economist, Milton Friedman, who infamously, again, perhaps, has written, "There's only one and only one social responsibility of business, to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits." Again, we see this as a legitimation, or this has been taken as a legitimation of the idea that perhaps greed is good, right? That business, and this is crucial when thinking about the moral underpinnings of these kinds of claims, is not that the pursuit of private profits by business or the pursuit of self-interest by an individual is bad, but in fact it generates a societal good. And again, to go back to the Fable of the Bees, the idea of bees sort of working together in their collective to produce bigger outcomes. It's worth noting that Friedman does add, but so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And these rules of the game, again, we'll think about this afternoon, or we'll try to think about this afternoon in terms of institutions. Okay, so what implications, does this have, or might this have, for the development of AI? Well, let's turn for a moment to thinking about state and market, because Friedman suggests that, well, it's about private profit. Of course, when we think about AI, we tend to primarily think about cutting-edge developments in artificial intelligence as taking place within the context of private firms, especially in North American and perhaps a slightly lesser degree European and Japanese contexts. But perhaps we may think about that a little bit more broadly when we look at other parts of the world, as I'll hint in a few moments. So private firms certainly are key players in the development of AI, but what about the state? I'm going to suggest the following. So does the state only play a regulatory role, sort of putting in place rules of the game, as Friedman noted? Even when we've talked about government today, much of it has been put in terms of policy and regulation. So how can, with an idea, I would suggest a sort of implicit idea, that the state stands outside of these developments in AI. So developments in AI are taking place in firms, so really they're taking place in the market. And the state really stands outside, and if anything, it sort of seeks to regulate the market from the outside. And this is, I would suggest, a reflection of a kind of a well-held view, or a broadly held view of state and market as quite separate, right? So you have the market, so this is the arena of firms, this is the arena of individual self-interest, the arena of transactions on one side, And we have the state on the other side, which sometimes seeks to regulate or to intervene, of course, in common parlance. So oftentimes, state and market are posited as competing and separate entities. And in many cases, they're competing separate entities, perhaps acting on society. What I want to suggest is that state and market rather are mutually reinforcing domains of power and authority for governing society. So rather than thinking about state and market as separate, we should think about them very much together in their role that they play in governing society. Now, I'll give some examples of this as we go forward. And so instead, we might reconstitute our view of state and market in thinking about ideas of embeddedness. Of course, these ideas of embeddedness I'm using here are probably most famously associated with the work of Karl Polanyi. And here we can think about state and market as deeply embedded in society. And this has big implications, particularly when we turn to thinking about the moral implications of state and market actions. So what I'm going to suggest is that all state and market actions, all modes of operation, all attempts to govern, attempts to make profit by state actors, by market actors, are all mediated through, shaped by, and emerge from moral considerations and moral beliefs that are deeply embedded in the societies in which they operate. I'll try to give some examples of this as we go forward, as well as some ways through which we can think about this analytically in terms of thinking about the development of AI. So this approach would suggest that the development of AI is, on one hand, driven by different economic and political forces, right? And we don't want to think about these as entirely separate, economic purely in the context of market and political purely in the context of the state, right? As we've noted, these are fundamentally intertwined. And as I've suggested, in turn, these forces are shaped by different ethical considerations as well as moral imperatives and beliefs. All right. So having laid out a sort of big tent, or sort of like a sort of high-level framing for thinking about questions of political economy in the context of AI, how might we think about this in sort of more concrete terms? So here I'm going to try to offer a very brief sketch, and this is very much reflecting early thinking in the context of artificial intelligence and the development of AI, but a brief sketch of an institutional approach to thinking about the moral embeddedness of AI. Okay, so I've sort of hinted, or I've sort of noted that, or argued that state and market should be considered to be embedded in society. And of course, societies vary both across place and time, right? So across countries, for example, and certainly temporally in different time periods. So what I'd like to suggest is that in different country contexts, the development of AI today is framed through different moralized political economic logics. So let me just sketch out three very brief examples that I'll chat about for maybe half a minute each. So for instance, we might think about the development of AI in China. So when we think about AI in China, one of the first things that comes to mind is, of course, the social credit scoring system that China has been developing and putting in place over the course of the last couple of years. And so an immediate question that rises in this context is first, what is this all about? Is it about governance? Most people would sort of think, yes, very much so. And also the general view would be to see this in the context of governance by a non-democratic state, right? So single party state in China. And certainly the idea of the sort of political economic logic in China typically is one of being very top-down. But in fact, as many who focus on China would suggest, in fact, the way that governance in China works, far from being purely top-down, is in fact a very interesting intermixing of top-down and bottom-up. So what we find, for example, in the context of the development of social credit scoring, is that it hasn't been driven by Beijing or by leading party figures in the Communist Party, but rather it emerges from experiments and innovations that took place in the city, as well as provincial levels of China. So many of these experiments began through combinations of private firms as well as state-owned firms at the urban as well as the provincial levels in China. And as is the case in many other domains of Chinese governance, the successes that emerged from some of these experiments filtered up towards Beijing, up in the party mechanism, and then were diffused back to additional experiments in other parts of the country. And then these experiments really then become supported through financial outlays, through political recognition of of especially party members, especially at the political level, that are involved at the provincial and urban scales and so forth. So it's this dynamic exchange between the provinces and cities on one hand and Beijing and the central party on the other that serves to provide an explanation of what's taking place in this development of social credit scoring, again, from the perspective of governance. And so having these kinds of insights or thinking about what kinds of the political economic logics that guide these kinds of technological developments in a context like China provides important insights for thinking about the particular paths of development that research in AI and development of AI may actually take. Especially if we think about this comparatively. So of course we can think about the United States. So one logic certainly in China is certainly governance, but also technological catch-up. So the Chinese premier announced last year that he wants China to be the leader in AI by 2030. And much of the sort of political and especially economic support that is now flowing towards AI research and the development of capacities, technological capacities in AI is very much fueled by the broader political economic logic in China of catch-up with the West, and in particular with the United States, generally as a global economic and political hegemon, but also as the recognized leader in artificial intelligence research. So again, we may ask these questions about the United States. So what sort of logics shape the development of AI in the US? So again, when we think about AI in the US, the first things that come to mind are Google, or firms, so Google, Facebook, certainly at the lead, followed by others. So the questions maybe about Amazon and so forth. So we tend to think about the large platform firms that are the dominant and most visible players in artificial intelligence in the US. And certainly that's not inaccurate. However, we'd also want to think about the role of the state. Again, much of the thinking of the role of the state in the US context tends to be about regulation. So we've had a couple mentions of some of the kinds of policy directives that have been put in place to try to regulate the development of AI in the United States. But these really have come quite late. They were only really in the last couple of years. And these include policy proposals or policy documents that were put out first by the Obama administration in 2016. And then there was more recently a statement by the Trump administration on artificial intelligence last year. And so the idea in the US, the kind of logic that people tend to think is that, well, the market is forging ahead and the state is typically falling behind, trying to regulate as best as it can a rapidly changing technology. But I would suggest that a sort of view of the US political economy, especially one that thinks about governance, might offer a slightly different approach. We should think a little bit more closely, for example, about the interrelationships between many of these private firms and the security apparatus in the United States, for instance. And ways in which the security apparatus, so the NSA and other branches of security in the United States, have facilitated, engaged with, supported many of the developments in artificial intelligence that we see in many of the firms that I mentioned before, in ways that in fact may seem not unlike what many people think about when they consider social credit scoring in China. Finally, I turn to one other context very briefly, which is in India. And here again, I want to focus on the idea of these political economic logics and the way in which they shape developments in artificial intelligence. But I'd also like to emphasize the role of history, again, to sort of to add weight to the perspective that I'm trying to offer about the importance, of embeddedness. So when we talk about these political economic logics, or when we talk about the role of moral beliefs and the way in which these are embedded in society, these all tend to have long historical or deep historical foundations. And in places like India, of course, this is no exception. So I'll give one brief example, which I hope will highlight this. And this is Other, which many people may be familiar with, is a new digital-based system, biometric-based system, in India that aims to be able to identify every Indian citizen through biometric data, so fingerprints, retinal scans, and so forth. So the purported logic of the Other system is one of welfare provision. So it's one of it's the way in which it's been sort of legitimized and the way in which it's been offered to Indian society is as a corrective to past corruption. In India, there's a deep feeling, sort of broadly held across society, that state officials, especially at government officials, especially at state and local levels, the assumption tends to be that they're deeply corrupt, and much of this sort of set of beliefs about state corruption go back to at least the 1970s, under when a variety of transformations took place in Indian governance under then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. And so as a corrective to this, the current government suggests that new modes of use or new uses of digital technologies, new means of identifying, for example, welfare recipients, or identifying recipients of state benefits, will remove all possibilities of corruption by local government officials. Right? So this is a technological solution that's being offered to a deeply held political and social problem. Again, so this moral imperative of addressing these issues of corruption in the Indian context serves to justify and legitimize the implementation of a system that raises all the kinds of concerns that we've heard today. So questions about privacy, for example, certainly, as well as concerns with how this data that's being captured by over 1 billion Indians might be used for commercial purposes by yet unnamed firms, yet unnamed private actors. So again, we see how these local political-economic logics shape the development of artificial intelligence in this context. And much of the research and many of the new startups that are operating in this space in India are explicitly geared towards the benefits that can be accrued from participating in this system. So it's playing a fundamental role, again, not unlike the social credit scoring system in China, in serving as a hub, a sort of locus and a driver in many respects of the development of AI technological capabilities in India. Okay, so I just want to turn for a moment to unpacking a little bit further from an institutional perspective, so following on those 3 examples I just gave, unpacking a little bit further what I mean by the moral and institutional embeddedness of AI. So what does this mean in more concrete terms? So I'll organize this in a couple of areas. So first, in thinking about the development of AI, and I've hinted at this quite a bit, it's crucial for us, of course, to think about the role of technological innovation. And within this, the goals and objectives of actors that are engaged in AI research and development, and how these goals and objectives vary across public and private sector organizations, for example, university-based researchers and researchers in other domains, as well as, of course, across country contexts. Crucial to this is also the imaginaries that animate researchers in these domains. So, what sort of future, what sort of possibilities do they imagine machine learning can accomplish? What kinds of goals are possible? And what kinds of objectives do they have in mind? And crucially, in many ways, how are these informed by local cultural norms and beliefs? Relatedly, we want to think about the array of organizations that are involved in the development of artificial intelligence. So certainly firms, as we've heard a lot of today, and also from me, but also think about public research labs of various sorts. And again, what kind of variation might we see in things like objectives, goals, incentives, and so forth across different kinds of organizations that are involved in the development of artificial intelligence? And then third, thinking about national political economies. So again, going from these layers of embeddedness, so thinking about public and private sector organizations as embedded in national political economies, where institutions and institutional arrangements such as financial markets, labor markets, legal rules, including but not limited to intellectual property rights, become very important in shaping the particular directions that developments in AI might take. And then finally, thinking about the global political economy, right? So national political economies certainly do not stand alone. We live in a globalized world. So thinking about how this manifests in concrete terms, for example, through interfirm networks, as well as through other means, such as the development and deployment of global rules and norms. So how can we think about this a little bit visually? So if we think about artificial intelligence and the development of AI as nested or embedded in public and private sector organizations, this is where they take place. And it's important for us never to forget that organizational context. Again, those organizations are embedded in important ways in national level political economies, which in turn are embedded in the global political economy. So we can think about this and sort of imagine this embeddedness very much in this way. And so the point here really is to suggest that institutional arrangements shape patterns of innovation. Right? So it's crucial for us to think about how institutional arrangements vary at these different levels and the kinds of implications that they may have for the development of AI. And crucially, again, it's important for us to note and always remember that many of these institutions, and I'm going to talk about a few of these institutions in a moment, are themselves the historical outcomes of various political struggles in some of these national political economies. I'll give some examples of this in a moment. Okay, so here's a way in which we can think about this in a little bit more detail. So if we take the first two levels, so thinking about the development of artificial intelligence in public and private sector organizations, we might think about how this is shaped by a couple of institutional arrangements in a couple of domains. So finance, for example, education and training. So both of AI researchers, but also of others in society as well. So for example, one of the biggest and perhaps most contentious questions around, which I don't think has come up actually very much today, around the development of AI is not only privacy, but also the future of work. So what are the implications of the development of artificial intelligence, especially as embedded in automation and new robotics for workplaces in the manufacturing sector, but also in service sectors as well. So we may think about education and training, labor, as well as rules on interfirm relations. So what kinds of rules govern the ways in which firms share or not information, the ways in which mergers and acquisitions can take place, what kinds of data sharing can is facilitated between different firms and so forth, and what are the implications then for the development of markets in these contexts. So I'm going to suggest, sort of building on this typology, a distinction that we can draw. And this distinction is familiar perhaps to many from work on the varieties of capitalism, probably most famously associated with, but not only with, Peter Hall and David Soskis, where we can divide some political economies, so some national political economies, especially in the industrialized world, into what they've described as liberal market economies and coordinated market economies. So liberal market economies as a typology, the sort of an ideal typical typology. The best examples of this are the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada. The argument is that many of these institutions of finance, of labor, of interfirm relations, and so forth, take particular forms in these contexts with important implications for the ways in which, for example, technological innovation in domains such as AI go. So for example, in finance, finance in these places tends to be short-term and market-based. So stock markets are primary institutions of finance, for example, and stock markets in our contemporary moment, especially in places like the US and the UK, are really driven by short-term profit considerations. So it's all about earnings calls and really high churn in many of these contexts. Now, of course, we're talking about AI, and so you may say, but these are early-stage technologies, right? And so they rely less perhaps on stock markets, though maybe that's where they all want to go at some point, but perhaps much more on angel investments and venture capital. But similarly, in these contexts, there's high pressure and relative short-termism in the angel and VC world, because of course, for anyone in the room who might be a venture capitalist, the most important thing you want to do when you invest in a new firm is to ensure that they can scale rapidly so that you can resell them at the highest profit. So again, even in the context of startups, this kind of short-termism holds. So these are the one way of thinking about financial market institutions in this context. Similarly, you might think about labor market institutions. So again, in liberal market economies, labor markets are characterized by high mobility, so ease of firing and hiring. Very, very weak employment contracts. And these hold in high-tech areas just as much as they hold in low-wage, relatively low-skill service jobs. Right? So think about the kinds of churn and the labor movement that we see, maybe labor mobility that we see in places like Silicon Valley, for example, or in other tech hubs in Boston, in Austin, Texas, and so forth. Right? So very, very high mobility, ease of hiring and firing is a characteristic of labor markets in this context. Similarly, education and training, of course, closely related to labor. What we see in many of these contexts is that the onus for investing in education and labor really falls on the individual, right? So this is why we see, for example, individuals taking on high levels of debt, for instance, in pursuing tertiary education. Right, so the logic of the system in liberal market economies is that the responsibilities for investing in education and training really falls on the individual. And finally, with respect to rules on interfirm relations, we see a market-based competition policy. Now, of course, many may say cynically, if you look at the US, there is no competition policy, because what we see, especially in this context, is the growth of these massive firms. And so we see oligopolistic structures dominating these spheres. But nevertheless, the way in which, the logic under which interfirm relations operates in liberal market context is very much through the market. So we see mergers and acquisitions, for example. We see technology purchases. We see the kinds of exchanges that take place between firms operating through market-like behavior. By contrast, if we're to think about coordinated market economies, and here the classic examples would be Germany and Japan, what we see is very, very different. So in finance, for example, tends to be much more long-term, tends to be bank-based. Labor, of course, is radically different. We see in both the German and in a different way, but similarly in the Japanese context, long-term employment contracts. So lifetime employment, for example, in Japan. Co-determination in Germany. We see different kinds of, we see radically different modes of industrial relations in these contexts. And these have important outcomes. For example, we see much lower mobility across firms. Education and training in these places is done much more through firms. So it's firm-based investments in education and training. So the firm that you work for will invest in your education, will train you to be able to use existing technologies as well as new technologies, unlike in the US, the UK, Canada, and so forth. And finally, we see very, very different rules and norms on interfirm relations. We see a much more cooperative system of, that manifests, for example, in shared standards. Again, crucially important in high technology fields like AI, as well as technology transfer. Right, so radically different set of arrangements that constitute these national political economies across these two sort of ideal typical ideal typical categories of national political economies, liberal and coordinated markets. And this manifests in really important ways. So to turn back to thinking about labor, for example, and questions about the future of work, what we see in the United States, for example, is fear of robots coming. Right? And there's a sort of idea that it's just a matter of time before most jobs are automated out of existence. There are endless reports on this from organizations like McKinsey and many others. And it's difficult to pick up any tech publication or most business dailies or certainly weeklies without finding numerous articles in any given week that offer new data, new projections that suggest how jobs are being destroyed across a whole range of domains. Now, one view of this is that this is just an outcome of the development of these new technologies, right? As the technologies get better, they will take over jobs. Of course, another view suggests that, of course, these technologies aren't deterministic, right? They're embedded in the social and political context from which they emerge, and they can have many outcomes and many manifestations, and they can be utilized in many different ways. And so one example is thinking about collaborative robots, so cobots in the Japanese context, where Japan, of course, is the world leader in robotics. Rather than, or in contrast to the United States, where there's fear of the robots coming, in Japan, what we see in many contexts is, in fact, robots that are being developed to work alongside human workers. Right, and of course we see this in the most classical of contexts in an automobile factory in Japan. All right, so with that, let me turn finally to saying something very, very brief about the global political economy, right? So again, we started by suggesting that the development of AI takes place within organizational settings, which are in turn embedded in national political economies, which of course is embedded in our global political economy. So what about the global? Like, how does this matter, following along the lines that I've been discussing? Well, let me just offer one contemporary case as a very quick example. So we might think about the development of global mobility networks of technological innovation, finance, and crucially control, so managerial control that manifests through the ownership of shares, especially preferential shares, both in startup firms and in established companies in the mobility space, in the development of ride-hailing platforms and autonomous vehicles. And so here I'm going to show a graphic which, as you can see, is not mine, but a graphic which I really like, which offers one way of understanding, or at least viewing, what the global ride-hailing space looks like. And of course, ride-hailing and the development of ride-hailing and the development of AVs are deeply intertwined in ways that many in the room are familiar with. And so this perspective really centers some of the main ride-hailing firms in the world. But there are other ways in which we could look at this. So for example, we might center some of the financial market act, the financial services firms instead. But nevertheless, what we see is, see if this works. Nope. So we see is, of course, so the ride-hailing firms in black. So Didi is the leading ride-hailing firm in China. As many may know, Uber used to compete with Didi in China up until 2016. It was a massive loss-making effort by both firms. They both are losing over $1 billion, it's estimated, per year. And eventually, Uber, on one hand, sold out to, but really did a share swap with Didi and exited the market. So we have Didi in China. We have, of course, Uber and Lyft. Ola is the large ride-hailing firm in India, and Grab is a large ride-hailing firm in Southeast Asia, Singapore-based. And so what we see are these networks of ownership relations and cross-investments between the ride-hailing firms who are in black, sets of financial service firms and actors in red, the most important of which I would suggest is SoftBank, but there are many others. SoftBank is a Japanese-based fund. Of course, we also see many of the traditional automakers as well. So especially at the top, we see Toyota, Tata in India, Volvo, Fiat, GM, and so forth. And then finally, some of the, or what we might now think about as the conventional tech firms. So Microsoft, Alibaba, Tencent, Apple, and so forth. And what this graphic really tries to show is an interconnection, a deep interconnection between these firms, which we can map using data on cross investments, but then we can also draw inferences about what this means for technology flows as well. And so one of the things that this suggests is that trying to think about the development of artificial intelligence, certainly in the autonomous vehicle context, is impossible without thinking about these kinds of global networks and how they flow, how they function, not just in terms of the exchange of finance and technology, which network analysis like this or a network view like this can suggest is quite benign, and money is just flowing and people are investing in places where they may make money. But rather, I would suggest we think about these as networks of power and control that might also determine the particular paths that the development of AI might take in each of these places. So with that, I'll summarize and conclude. What I've tried to suggest today is taking a political economy approach to thinking about ethics in AI is about thinking about societal transformation. Harkens back, of course, to the rise of modern capitalism, but certainly now thinking about it in the emergence of AI, Industry 4.0, and so forth. It's crucial to pay attention to questions of power, governance, and institutions. But across all of these, it's crucial to think about the moral underpinnings of power, of governance, and of institutions. So what sorts of reciprocal, what sorts of moral understandings and moral beliefs underpin the kinds of relations that we see embedded in different institutions? So why do we have co-determinism in Germany? Why is there this deep idea in Germany that there should be, that workers, for example, should sit at a similar level in boardrooms with managers, whereas in the United States, there's very much not that belief, for example. Why is there the belief, for example, in the development of robotics in Japan, that from the beginning, robots should be imagined as working alongside human workers rather than as a replacement for workers? And again, what difference do those sort of moral beliefs, those societal understandings have for the way in which these new technologies are imagined by the researchers who are developing them, and the firms, what sort of incentives are in place for the firms and other organizations that are pursuing these kinds of developments. So I'll stop there. Thanks.